Hello, my name is Greg Phelps, and I am your host to the Wealth Summit. Our mission here at the Summit is simple. We want to educate and empower you with actionable tools, tips, and tactics to help you grow, protect, and maximize your personal wealth. Today, I have a very interesting guest on with me on a not-so-delicate subject sometimes. I have Lauren Gadkowski, Lindsay, and she's going to discuss planning for your last hurrah, why funeral planning is important to everyone. Lauren, hopefully I pronounced your last name there okay. Are you ready to help us master our wealth?
I am, Greg. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Okay, so a little bit about Lauren. Lauren is a certified financial planner and the director of financial planning at Personal Financial Advisors in Covington, Louisiana. She focuses on fee-only comprehensive financial planning for individuals and corporate clients. She enjoys helping her clients establish and realize their financial goals and providing the objective overview that fee-only planning allows for. Client education is her highest priority, and she's been a practicing financial planner since 1998. She's a member of the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors, or NAPFA, a national organization of fee-only financial planners. She's also been quoted in national periodicals on financial topics, including CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, Money Magazine, U.S. News, and World Report. She lives in Houston, Texas, with her husband Lee and daughter Grace, and telecommutes to her office in Louisiana. She enjoys reading and travel in her spare time, which it doesn't sound like she has too much of, and she is the leader for her daughter's Girl Scout troop and vice president of the local PTA. Lauren, you've got a lot going on. Take a second and fill in any gaps that I might have missed.
Yeah, I think that probably the other piece that I like people to know about me is in my previous life, I was a high school teacher. So to me, that means there are no stupid questions, and I do really view myself as an educator as well as a financial planner, and I like to make sure that my clients really understand the decisions that we're making and are part of the process. I really believe that there are no stupid questions. So I do think that this is one of those topics where there's no easy way to discuss it, but hopefully I'll give you some tips and tools to make it a little bit of an easier conversation.
Okay. And for the wealth masters out there, Lauren and I were talking offline. I found this very interesting. But Lauren actually wrote an article that was picked up by Wall Street Journal and has since developed some relationships with close to, what, a couple hundred people or so, Lauren?
Yeah, I had emails from about 200 people who reached out to me following this article, including as recently as last week, and this was an article that ran months ago. So I think it was a topic that really resonated with people, and it was interesting for me to communicate with folks and understand why they were reaching out, and so many different stories that people had to share, so many reasons why they felt very strongly that this was something that they wanted to have in place. So I would like to share some of those today to help you all understand why I think this is a very critical piece to have as far as your financial plan goes.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, I'm looking forward to learning more because, as I mentioned, this isn't a comfortable topic to really discuss.
Right.
So the first thing we're going to discuss is it's not if you die, it is when you die, right, Lauren?
Right, and this is a hard concept because nobody really wants to think about their demise. And I'll have folks in client meetings that will say, well, if I die prematurely, and we talk about that in the context of estate planning and life insurance and things like that. But it is hard to acknowledge that at some point for all of us, our life is going to end. And we talk about ways to make sure that we have the best quality of life that we can, that we exercise and diet and do what we can to keep our health intact. But the fact of the matter is that none of us really know how much time that we have. And I do think that this is not just something for people to do when they're older. I have a funeral plan in place. I have my sisters, a lot of friends. And I think as people experience this, having a loved one pass, they understand why it is such an important piece. So very early on in my career, I was very fortunate because I worked with my mom, who was a financial planner, and she's the one who developed this idea back in the 80s. And I was working with a couple, and the woman was a nurse that had a lot of medical issues and knew that her time was somewhat limited, and also knew that her husband was going to have a very difficult time carrying out her wishes because he was very emotional and just a lovely, lovely man. And she had one son. And we agreed that very extensive funeral planning to minimize the things that they had to take care of after her passing was going to be very, very helpful. And one of the things I quoted in this article was her son coming to me after she had passed with tears rolling down his face and saying, "This was the greatest gift that you could possibly give me, to know exactly what my mother wanted, to have it in writing so that I can carry out her last wishes and celebrate her the way she wanted to be celebrated. So I do think it's hard to come to terms with the fact that we are all going to pass. But I do think that there is some comfort in knowing that you're carrying out the last wishes of someone who you loved. And I do think the written piece is extremely important, because I'll have a lot of folks who say, oh, sure, my kids know what I want and things like that. And then come to find out that, oh, it was a conversation we had at Christmas dinner one time and I told them what I wanted. Mm-hmm. Having it written down is so critical, just because in that moment of grief, it's very, very hard to recall those conversations and those details.
Okay. So you mentioned something kind of interesting in there. We talked about it's not if, it's when, because we're all terminal from birth, I suppose.
Sure.
But you mentioned some key or a key phrase to me, and you mentioned, how do you want to be celebrated? So I find that an interesting concept. I mean, aren't we supposed to wear black and all be sad and cry at the funeral?
Right. And actually, I've done some research into this, because psychology is something that's definitely related to financial planning and how people view money and how people view death. And there is actually a process of rethinking and reframing how we view death. And if we can think of it as a celebration of that person's life, it helps to take death out of a grim place where it usually is referred to. And not that it's a sad thing, it's a loss, but to think about that person and what they might be, how they want to be celebrated going forward. And so in the article I mentioned some of my favorite celebrations. One of my dear friends' moms passed away, and their family was 3 Italian daughters who were known for their cooking. And she had a huge party at a country club, and her sisters made all this amazing Italian food, and everyone came in and ate and celebrated and just told stories, and it was a wonderful, wonderful tribute to her. I have a client who played in a park as a little girl and has requested that her ashes be interred in a dirt ball in the roots, and I didn't even know you could do this, in the roots of a tree that she has designated to be planted in the park upon her demise. Wow. I have a friend who unfortunately passed away very early in his early 40s, who was a fisherman, and his wife is actually having his ashes interred in a living reef in the body of water that he fished, where he loved, and to celebrate his life. So you can be very, very creative. Now, my practice is in Covington, Louisiana, just outside New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't know, New Orleans knows how to do death. People have parades. They literally will hire mourners to march in the parade, and they have very elaborate parties to celebrate people who have passed away. So I've had a lot of fun with my clients planning to the last detail, and I'm talking the kind of bourbon that they want to be served at the open bar, at the jazz brunch, at the particular restaurant. So I think that maybe helps me to develop this process, because I was practicing in a place where death is maybe more openly discussed than in some other places. But I do think that it does help to think about, okay, this is how I want people to remember me. This is the kind of party that I want to have. And not everybody wants to have a party or be celebrated in those different ways. But I do think it's worth, reaching outside the box and talking about, what do you want to be remembered? And again, having those particulars written down for whoever's going to be executing these details for you is so very helpful.
Right, and that leads me perfectly into why it must be in writing. And you had mentioned a second ago, so if I were to tell my boys, hey, when my time comes, I just want you to have a nice quiet funeral and whatever, and I say that at Christmas, and then maybe a year later at Christmas I say, hey, I changed my mind, now I want a party. They don't know what to do. Right.
So on this worksheet, and it's pretty basic. I mean, it's only 2 pages long, just because for me the point is to get the conversation going and to get people thinking about it. And I've had clients use it with their parents and use it with their children, and it really is a conversation starter. But to take death out of that dark place and maybe take it to a little bit more of a place where you can say, I would like to celebrate and remember you the way that you want to be remembered. Can you tell me what some of those things might be? And what I have found out is that there's so many things that people didn't know about their loved ones that are important to them. So for me, my big thing is the music. And I will say probably on an annual basis, I go in and I revise my worksheet, and I'll say, oh, you know what, I thought of another song I'd like to have played at my service. And there's a lot of things that maybe you don't care about. You can say, oh, that's not important to me. Whatever you want to decide is important to you. But I do think it's really interesting and insightful and telling to realize what is important to someone who you're close to. And the other piece of this is having it written down is you're going to be grief-struck. You're going to be in mourning. You're going to be potentially in shock. Having it written down that you can potentially even hand it off to somebody else to execute things if you're not in a state to do so is so very helpful. And it really is such a gift. And it's for you in that we're celebrating your life, but it's also a gift to those that you're leaving behind because it brings tremendous comfort to be able to celebrate you the way that you want it to be celebrated.
Yeah, to do it the right way.
Absolutely.
That makes perfect sense. Absolutely. So I want to circle back real quick because we kind of flew by this very critical concept here. You actually created a worksheet, right? So this is what was linked into the Wall Street Journal article, I believe?
Correct. Yes. Well, so what happened was they basically had an email and said, if you're interested in contacting Lauren and getting a copy of this worksheet, here's the way to get a hold of her. And they had a Wall Street Journal email for me. And that was where I got the 200 people who have reached out to me. So this worksheet is on my website and it's available for free. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, to go ahead and download it. Share it with your parents, your children, your neighbors, anybody that might be beneficial, that it might be beneficial for. And like I said, it's pretty simple, but I think it brings up a lot of points of conversation that you may or may not have discussed with your loved ones. Things that you may hold important or things that you've never actually asked, people whose wishes you may be in charge of executing.
Okay. So this worksheet, we're going to link to it, the page on your website. We're going to link to that on your speaker page. So the Wealth Masters out there, if you want to download that, just go check out Lauren's speaker page, point, click, and go in there and get her worksheet. One other interesting thing that was going through my mind is I thought, if whatever age you are, if you're towards the end of your years, it's probably easier for me to go to my loved ones with this worksheet already filled out and say, hey, I've done all the heavy lifting for you. This is what I'd like, and I'd appreciate it if you carry this out. And then all that weight, I suppose, off of the spouse or the kids or relatives would just be lifted.
Absolutely. And I do think that it's interesting to, give it to them, give it some time to process and say, if there's anything you want to discuss or there's any reasons why. So, for example, my mom had a song listed on hers. And I said, well, is there any significance to this song? And she told me this wonderful story about going to church when she was growing up with her mom and her aunt and her cousins and why that song was so important. And that was a story I had never heard. I might have never heard if I hadn't asked the question. So it is interesting for me when I'm doing this with clients to say, well, is this a story that people might know? And some clients do something called an ethical will, which is where you leave your wishes and your values and things like that. And not everyone will do that, but this is a way to share some of those values and share why these things might be of importance to you. And so it's another way to kind of pass on that legacy.
Yeah, I would say it's also connecting on a deeper level with your loved ones in that time.
Definitely.
So we're going to switch gears here a little bit and just kind of talk about working with a funeral home. I mean, now we're getting into the logistics and dealing with that. Explain to us a little bit about that.
Right. And so I'm really lucky because actually we have a client who's a funeral home, so I've been able to sort of beta test all this with them.
From the inside out.
A lot of good suggestions as to things that maybe I hadn't considered. So I revise this worksheet as situations come up and I say, oh yeah, that should be on there too. But the funeral home, again, think about it, they do this all day long. Think about your job that you do all day long, and you're good at it because that's all you do. They have been through so many situations. They have been through so many different circumstances. So I do think that if that is something that you're comfortable with, to get professionals involved is really, really helpful. And in that Greg was talking about, complete the form, give it to your loved ones, you can do the same thing with a memorial service or a funeral. You can go to a funeral home, you can pick everything out, you can pay for it in advance if you like, But it's also just great because it's one more thing to kind of have checked off the list. You know that it's going to be done the way you want it to be done, and it's one less thing that your loved ones have to consider with all the other logistics that go along with the dying process. So a funeral home can really be a wonderful resource. In the town that I grew up in, for example, there are only two. It's very small. And so you have your choice of funeral home A or funeral home B. If you live in an area where there are many, think about services that you have been to that resonated with you, and maybe reach out to those places and see what kind of services they offer. Because really, again, like this process, they're very into planning ahead, and they're very willing to help you and very, very compassionate.
And as you mentioned, you can actually get all of the logistics taken care of in advance, and that takes even more weight off of your family and your loved ones.
Exactly. So not only have you thought about it and planned it, you've actually paid for it so that it'll be executed in a timely manner once the circumstances happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think this next topic is kind of interesting, and I imagine having that psychology type of perspective, and actually especially having the New Orleans, let's celebrate and let's party, death perspective. Why is death so morbid? I mean, why don't we have a different perspective on it? Why is it such a taboo topic?
And it's interesting because if you look at other societies, it's our society, it's Western culture that really has placed such a taboo on it. And personally, I'm working very hard in my practice to make it something that's more discussed. You will notice as you get older, as I have gotten older, but as I work with clients who are older, they're much more open to talking about death. So I do think that as our society and the baby boomers get closer to those ages and attend more funerals and things like that, it's a more open topic. But it's not something that people really want to bring up for whatever reason. And I think that as a financial planner, that's a huge part of my job, is to have those hard conversations with people. So if this tool can help you, especially if you're not uncomfortable with the topic, to have a conversation with your children or your parents who may be less comfortable with it, this can be a really great way to segue into that. That's something that's not quite so comfortable. I may have gone 180 degrees the other way. I have a 7-year-old daughter who will walk up to me and say, "Oh, Mommy, that necklace, I really like your necklace. Can I have it when you die?" So, I may have made her a little bit too comfortable, but, if you think about when you usually learn about death, oftentimes it's when a pet passes or somebody very close to you, like an elderly relative, passes away. And I think this can be, for younger folks, a great opportunity to talk about death with children, that it is a natural part of life, and that's when we celebrate all the good things. And the grieving process is incredibly important. I believe that you need to go through it to move on to the next stage. And, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. But I do feel like having some of these logistics out of the way allow people to move through that grieving process that they need to move to more easily.
Okay. So it's mostly an Americanized, I guess, bereavement process that we see here. I mean, obviously we live here, so, but you don't see that in other cultures around the world so much?
A lot of cultures handle death a lot better than we do, I will say that. A lot of them have more rituals associated with it, but they'll also have rituals associated with coming of age and different rituals associated with marriage. So we've lost a lot of that in our quest to sort of, assimilate into our culture. And so I think a little bit of that, it's a taboo topic as a result. And I think if we can try to make it less taboo, because it is a part of life, and it's going to happen to all of us at some point, and if we can try and make it a more comfortable topic, I think it's going to be an easier thing to deal with when we do have to deal with it.
Okay. And so as far as the documents that you need to be, aware of, living trust and wills and things like that, let's kind of transition to that and just give us the basics. What are the high points that we need to be aware of for our funerals?
Sure. And the funeral planning document is not an official document by any capacity. It's just your wishes. So we do want to work with an estate planning attorney to get your last wishes in place as far as your will, And I also recommend incapacitation documents such as a durable power of attorney and a medical power of attorney, and that gives someone the ability to make decisions for you if you're incapacitated in a financial and a medical capacity. So as far as last wishes, a lot of people don't realize that usually your will is read after your funeral or your memorial service. Mm-hmm. So some people will have their wishes, oh, I would love to be buried in my red dress, in their actual will, and then you have it read after the fact, and then you realize we blurred in the blue dress, oh my goodness. So that's another reason why the funeral document, I think, is important. But I think that money very, very well spent, and I tell people this all day long, to get an estate planning attorney, not just a lawyer, but an attorney who specializes in estate planning in your state because it is state specific, and to make sure that you have a will. In some states, you want to have a testamentary trust if you have minor children. You may need to have a revocable trust or an irrevocable trust, again, depending on your state laws. But what you do want to do is go into this attorney with open book, all your stories, all your people, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and let them know what you're trying to accomplish with these documents, and they can advise you as to which documents are going to be most appropriate. They're probably not going to talk to you about funeral wishes. They may, but this is a good document to complement all of those estate planning documents that you do with your estate planning attorney.
So it's more along the lines of planning. Just make sure you get this done ahead of time, because it's just, for example, your opening story with your friend, I believe. I mean, that would be horrible to just find yourself into that situation one day and nothing's done.
Right, right. I have a friend who reached out to me recently, and it was somebody who I've worked with professionally as well, who let me know that her dad passed away very suddenly. And luckily he was vacationing in a beautiful place with his second wife, but younger than anticipated for death, and didn't have anything in place, has 2 families, has properties in different states, and she actually posted on Facebook and said, public service announcement, please have this conversation with your parents, please know what documents they have in place, please ask the hard questions, because believe me, trying to figure it out on the other end has no picnic, and we are not really able to grieve him when we would like to, because we're too busy working out all the logistics of the mess that he's left behind for us. And she said, and I'm sure that's not what he intended. It's a consequence of not having done any formal planning.
Right. So, Lauren, that's going to kind of bring us to, how do I have these discussions? You sold me. I know I need to get this done, but how do I have these discussions with the people that I love?
Sure. I think, first of all, getting comfortable with the topic. If it's something that's going to bring you to tears when you mention it, that's probably not a great place to start from. So I do think that doing something like this funeral worksheet, where we can make it, I'm going to be celebrating, and take the death from the grim piece of it to the celebratory piece of it, is not a bad place to start. And it does help to have those conversations. Sometimes it can be things like, oh, this photo or this piece of furniture or this piece of jewelry, this is something that is important to me. Can you tell me the story behind it? And what would you like to have happen with this going forward? And I think that can be a good way in. Is there someone you would like to have this at some point in the future? And getting to the stories and getting to the emotional parts of it, I think, can help to break through some of that barrier. I will say a lot of the folks who reached out to me after the Wall Street Journal article said, I had a friend or a relative who died very suddenly and we didn't know anything that they wanted, similar to the story I just told, and that's what's motivating me to act like this. So unfortunately, a lot of people come to this realization because of a bad experience that they've had personally. So I do feel like my public service announcement is, please don't do that to your family if you possibly can. Think of a way in your particular emotional connection with your loved ones that might be an easier way to broach all of this. And I come by this honestly because my mom is a financial planner, my dad is a doctor, my sister's a doctor. We talked about death and dying probably at the dinner table every single night, and I didn't realize it was inappropriate until I had a friend stay over, and she just said, are your dinner table discussions always like that? And then I realized that maybe this wasn't normal. So, it is a little bit of a learning curve for some people, and I do think that some generations have a harder time with it because it's a very private matter. But I think if you come at it from a place of love and concern and caring, that really helps a lot to get the conversation started.
Okay. I'm going to bring us back here again. Can you just give us just a couple of, what's on this worksheet? What are just a couple of
Sure.
the highlights that we'd expect to see?
Sure. So some of the things that I think are maybe bigger decisions are a burial versus cremation, or some kind of other, disturbance, distribution of your body. Some people have very specific beliefs that they would like to have, certain things go different places. I know people who have donation wishes for different body parts, or they would like their body to be donated to science or a particular medical school. So there's no right or wrong way for this, but again, this is something that your loved ones may or may not know unless it's written down. I think religious preferences are very important to try and document. If you do have a particular church or a particular synagogue or a mosque or a particular place that is special to you, or if you don't, if you say, I want, no religion entered into it at all, if you have people that you would like to speak at your ceremony, if you have music, flowers. Another big one is flowers versus donations. I know people who feel very strongly that I don't want any flowers. I would rather the money go to a particular charity. That's probably a very big one to think about, and you can list more than one. And the other thing to think about with this funeral worksheet and the estate planning documents, also beneficiary forms that go along with this. So when you do your estate planning documents, you want to make sure that those beneficiary forms are matching. And that's another big piece that sometimes attorneys talk about it and sometimes they don't. So it's just kind of after the estate planning documents are done, make sure that that beneficiary form is done as well. But the funeral form has, places for that. And the reason I mentioned the beneficiary forms is that's another place that you could leave money to a particular charity in addition to the assets that are going to be distributed in your will, in addition to donations that people wanting to celebrate you may also make. So that's a big consideration for a lot of people, because usually people feel strongly that there is a particular charity, one or more, that they do want to have involved.
Okay. So it sounds to me like you've taken, in a lot of ways, I look at our profession as financial planners as we're kind of aggregators of good information, and sometimes it leads us down these niches. Like you have definitely developed a niche. So it sounds to me like you're taking in this checklist all of these potential things that you see people might want that they might not even think about. If you were to put me on the spot and say, what do you want to do with your funeral right now? I wouldn't have any idea. But if I looked at this checklist and I said, oh, that sounds like a great idea.
Right.
And you put it all together.
And to your point, it can be a worksheet that you do and hand to somebody, or it can be a conversation starter that you have with someone to discuss all these things. And it may be helpful to know, you know what, I could care less about flowers. I could care less about music, but I really want to make sure that there's really good cheesecake at my party afterwards. It's amazing to me what people prioritize, but you learn so much about that individual going through this worksheet with them. So I think it's good if someone decides to just complete it and give it to you, that's great, but take time to read it over and follow up maybe if you're comfortable doing that as well, because it can be a really great learning experience about that person.
Okay. So Lauren, that's going to bring us into, and I always ask our guests, give us the top 1, 2, 3 things that pop into your mind that the viewers out there need to be aware of, the most important takeaways.
Sure. I think number 1 is have an estate plan and have it written down. So work with an estate planning attorney, have a will, see if there's a need for trust in your particular situation. And people will say, well, I don't have a whole lot of money. I don't have a whole lot of stuff that I need a will for. But if you have children, that to me is the number 1 reason why you need a will. So young people, this is for you as well. Have it written down, work with an expert in estate planning to make sure that it's done properly. Write down the funeral wishes. Have it in a place where someone can find it. Mail copies to people. I think it's a great idea to have a file, either an electronic file or a paper file, depending on how tech savvy you are, where people know this is where you find it. I have a red binder. I have it electronically saved as well, but I have a red binder that sits on my shelf in my office. And everybody knows that that is where all the important stuff is, that if anything happens, we have a house fire, save the red binder. So make sure that the people involved in this decision know that they're involved. And you laugh about that, but a lot of people don't realize that they're the person in charge of things. So let them know that they're in charge, but also give them copies of all these documents that they're going to need so that they can access them when the time comes, especially if they live far away.
I'm
so
just envisioning your husband running in and grabbing the red binder, making a beeline out the door.
Right. So,
okay.
True story.
So make sure you have your documents set up, get the right estate plan in order. A lot of this has to do with planning, obviously. Just you have to take some time and put some thought into this.
Sure.
You know, one of the interesting things I got out of it, and literally I'm sitting here thinking throughout my lifetime, death has always been such a negative and taboo thing, and I don't know why. I'm starting to think why should it really be so negative and taboo? So, no, thank you so much for sharing. So, Lauren, if the viewers out there, if they want to reach out to you, if they want to, I mean, we're going to put the link up on your speaker page,
sure.
and we'll have it here, on your contact page slide at the end. But if they want to reach out to you, why don't you go ahead and just share a couple of the best ways that they can, ask you further questions?
Absolutely. So I do have a website, which is mypfa, personalfinancialadvisors.com, and there is a contact slide in there, and you can reach out to me directly. My email is lauren.lindsay, Landsay, @mypfa.com, and my direct line at my office is 985-246-5775. I love hearing from people. I love the stories. I hope that this is a helpful tool to open up those difficult conversations and to make sure that you're helping your loved ones and you're getting your own celebration accomplished.
The way that you want it.
Absolutely.
And I can speak. I know I asked Lauren offline a little bit. I know she reached out to every one of those 200 people who had, further questions. So I think that's impressive. I
did. So many good stories. And for me, it was really interesting to see what resonated with people, and no two people had the same story. So, death is a deeply personal thing. And Greg, to your point, some of it is just how is it brought up in your family? If it isn't discussed in your family, like money, it may be an uncomfortable topic. So it may be that, an estate planning attorney or a financial planner or somebody who talks about it all day long is going to be comfortable with the topic, and that may be the first time you've interacted with somebody who's comfortable with the topic. So.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for your time today. It was an interesting topic, and I suppose we have our own preconceived notions about death, and hopefully, Wealth Masters out there, you've learned at least a little bit something about getting prepared for the eventuality that we are all going to die. So, Lauren, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Greg, for having me. I look forward to hearing from you.
Wealth Masters, either you control your money or it will control you. I would prefer you're the former, not the latter, especially in the case of death. Thank you very much. And this is Greg Phelps signing off.